at Genesis chapter 30. And we're going to be looking at Genesis 30 and 31 as we look at the life of Jacob. Bring you up to speed if you've missed with us last week. Jacob had received Leah as his wife, thinking it was Rachel. And then Jacob makes a deal with Laban, Leah and Rachel's father, to acquire Rachel, and so he has two wives, and they begin living with Laban in the same geographical area, and Laban allows Jacob to work for him. So Jacob's working for Laban, and he is living with the two daughters of Laban, and of course we know that Rachel is the one that Jacob favored over Leah. And as we left off in Genesis 29, we see that God opens up Leah's womb, and she begins to have children, but Rachel was barren. And so we see here, as we get into Genesis 30 and looking at the full story, we see the war in the clan, how that Jacob now is building his family, but it's going to be built within a battle and war. Jacob finds himself enslaved to his father-in-law. He's having issues with his wives, fighting over who is loved more. And in the midst of all of Jacob's issues, we see that God still has his hand on Jacob. And God's got a greater purpose for Jacob. And I want us to just really zero in on that fact tonight, that God has got a plan for us. God's got a greater purpose for us, oftentimes more than what we see. And the key is not to get caught up in everything around us, not to get caught up in the things of this life, and not to get caught up in the things we cannot control, but to be caught up in God, to trust in Him no matter what. And we see in Jacob's life that this really doesn't go the way it should. And yet God still uses him. And God is going to use these sons for a greater purpose. Mainly Judah and Levi. Of course, he will use Joseph later on, as we'll find leaving Genesis and going into Exodus. And so I want to just kind of, for a few minutes, look at the battle over childbearing. And I want us to look at verse 30, or chapter 30, starting in verse 1. It says, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. Give me sons, or I will die, she said to Jacob. Jacob became angry with Rachel and said, am I in a place of God? He has withheld offspring from you. So really probably not the best thing to say to a wife who is grieving over not being able to have children. But you see here Jacob maybe getting a little tired of this back and forth. Now it's easy for Jacob to say this because he's got a wife in Leah who is producing him sons. We see Leah has 3 sons prior to going into chapter 30, and I want to look at those sons for a moment. We back up to verse 32. The first and the eldest son, Reuben, Leah names him, and here's the thing that I've noticed out of the sons of Jacob. A lot of times sons are named for something significant in the family. It has a meaning behind it, and see that as you get into the prophets and different things. But here we see the turmoil and the anguish as these boys are being born to these women. And we see here the naming, the naming of the sons points towards feeling and approval opposed to significant things in their lives. Reuben, the Lord has seen my affliction. As we see both Leah and Rachel, they're focused on really themselves. And as I begin to kind of process that and look at this in context to contemporary time, I see that many times we get sidetracked from God because we get too focused on ourselves, what we don't have, how bad things are going in our lives. And when we allow too much of that focus to spill over into our actions, it creates issues emotionally and psychologically that really don't need to be created. If we, and I know it's easy to say this being a pastor, but if we allow God to lead us and are okay with the way God leads us, then we will live, as Paul says, we will live lives that are content and focusing our well-being not on what we have on this earth, what we've accomplished, but what God has given us. That's why Paul was able to say that he could lay down his life for the cause of Christ, because the things of this world matter nothing to him. It was all lost for the cause of Christ. And I see the lack of that here in Jacob's family and in their life as they are naming these sons. So Reuben the first is Simeon, which is the second born. And Simeon, the Hebrew name of Simeon, sounds like has heard. And so we would say that Leah more than likely named Simeon in response to God hearing her prayer or her cry. But what was that cry? That cry was to be accepted by her husband, because with these sons she's having, well, surely he'll love me now. She gets down in verse 33 of Genesis 29, and we see Simeon, and then right after that we see that she conceives, and she has Levi. And what does Levi mean? Levi means to be joined. The Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. Allergies are a terrible thing this time of year. The Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary breaks down kind of the etymology of Levi, and it really points us to the fact that Levi means to be joined. Well, what is she wanting to be joined to? She's wanting Jacob to love her like and even better than he loves Rachel. And so when we see these sons, we get down to Judah, the fourth one in chapter 29. And Judah, it sounds like to be praised. And so we see Judah be an object of praise, which is really significant when we get into understanding that Jesus comes through the tribe of Judah, and of course one to be praised. And so kind of see how that's broken down going into chapter 30. Well, after 4 sons, Rachel was like, I need sons, or I'm just going to die. And so Rachel comes up with this plan. Wrong decisions oftentimes are passed down. Whether Jacob and Rachel had talked about what Abraham and Sarah did, surely they knew. But here we see that Rachel's like, okay, this is how God must want me to have children. I'm going to give you my right-hand maid, Bilhah, and I want you to take her as wife and have children with her. And basically, Bilhah becomes a surrogate for Rachel. Well, we know that never works. And so Jacob does this, trying to make Rachel happy. And so he sleeps with Bilhah, and she conceives, and she bears Jacob a son. And Rachel calls his name Dan, Meaning God has vindicated me. And this is what she said. In verse 6, Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Yes, he has heard me and given me a son. So she named him Dan. And so here we see, however, when we look back in the life of Sarah and Abraham, that this wasn't good enough for Sarah. The temporary fix that man can provide is never good enough for long-lasting and fulfilling the purpose of God. And we see this here in the actions, the early actions of the patriarchs. And many times we do this very same thing. I mean, we look at all around us, the temporary fixes, drugs and alcohol and all the many things that we have at our disposal today as human beings, and many of them are temporary fixes. It's only when we submit to the lordship of God that we will truly find peace. Now, looking back on this, what if Rachel would have said, you know what, it's all in God's time. If God doesn't want me to have children, then so be it. And Jacob then would learn to love her without having children. And so we kind of see how we mess things up in our lives because we get self-centered. And that's what I really see in chapters 30 and 31 of Genesis, is that God uses self-centered people to bring them back around to the center of his purpose. And just a beautiful picture here of the providence of God. And so we move on, and we see here that Jacob sleeps again with Bilhah, and she bears another son, and his name is Naphtali. And Rachel names him this because she said, I have wrestled with God, and she felt like she had won. And so now we see Rachel has 2 children through a surrogate, through Bilhah, and Leah has the 4 sons. And so Leah then, she gets doesn't like this. She's not having children anymore, and so she pulls a chapter out of the playbook of surrogacy, and she says, okay, Jacob, you go in with Leah, and or Jacob, you go in with Zilpah, and let her be my surrogate. So through Zilpah, Jacob fathers Gad, and we see here that Gad actually it could be translated good fortune. And so Leah is like, this is my good fortune, and she's putting all of her her happiness in being one above her sister, and trying to win the favor of Jacob. And so then we go on and we see that we have a break in the children having sons, and so we get to Jacob having sons right after the second son with Zilpah is Asher. I almost skipped over that, getting to the mandrakes. And Asher really means happy. And so, Leah's happy now. I'm back to being on top. And then Reuben goes out, and there was a plant back in these times in this area that was labeled mandrake in the scriptures. And this plant had a fragrance that was pleasing. And many thought that it was an aphrodisiac type of a plant, and so was used later on in idol worship. But we also see that as fertility, it was a plant that would seemingly excite the sexual desires, and it was used or thought that it increased fertility. And so apparently it was a rare plant, and so Reuben finds it. Rachel finds out and says, oh, Leah, let me have, Rachel's like, I can't have children. Let me have some of your son's mandrakes. And Leah, in verse 15 of Genesis 30, says, isn't it enough that you have taken my husband? Now you also want to take my son's mandrakes? Well then, Rachel said, he can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. And so we see that these women, and Jacob goes along with it, and so he's just as guilty, that these women are driven by their own pleasures and what they can control, and really their own wants and wishes. And so here we see that as Jacob comes in from the field, Leah breaks the news, you're coming to my house tonight, to my tent, you're going to sleep with me. I bartered you for my son's mandrakes. And so that night, Leah conceives the fifth son through her. And so now we're at 4 and 29. This son will be the fifth one, specifically to Leah. Bilhah has had 2, Zilpah has had 2, and so we're up now to the ninth son. And so we see here Leah conceives, bears a son to Jacob, and names him Issachar. And here's the meaning behind that. Issachar means reward. So God has rewarded me, she says in verse 18, for giving my slave to my husband. And so again, we see this family and their battle over childbearing. We see that it's all about them, and they're justifying the things that they're doing for their pleasure and saying, oh, God's giving us, God's blessing us as we really step outside of God's natural purpose and plan. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying if you're having trouble in childbearing that you shouldn't seek, the means that we have today and help with fertility and so on and so forth. I think that we enter into that with prayer and understanding of God's purpose and His plan. But here we see that really it wasn't about God's purpose and plan. It was all about, I want to be better, I want to be happier, I want to feel more blessed. And so Leah then has another son in verse 19, and we see his name in verse 20 as being Zebulun. Again, Zebulun means honored, and Leah says, well, this is God's honor to me, or this is God's good gift to me. And then in verse 21, Leah has a daughter named Dinah. Now, Dinah was the 7th child from Leah. So I don't know if there's significance there, and this is, 7 being the end or perfection, whatever the case may be. However, we know that God allowed this to happen. And so Leah has 7 children, 6 boys, 1 girl. And really we see within the whole family line in this battle over childbearing, we see Jacob in a picture of God's covenant being played out, and God blessing Jacob to father many children. And we will go on to see that these children become very significant. And we see within this the promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that Abraham would be the father of many nations. And we're seeing that right here through man's sinfulness and inadequacies. So we get down to Dinah, and we leave off there with Leah. But then we go down and we see that God doesn't forget Rachel. And so in verse 22, God finally opens Rachel's womb, not literally, physically, to conceive. That makes sense, not literally, physically. But He opens her womb to conceive, and she has Joseph. And Joseph, names mean he adds. And so Rachel, God has added His favor. God has added to me a son. And of course Joseph, as we will find out later on, is favored because he is the firstborn of Rachel. And we see that that's going to cause problems in this whole war within this family. So after the battle over childbearing here, we see the accumulation of wealth. And if you read down in Genesis 30, 25, and on, we see that Jacob is working for Laban, and he works for him for somewhere around 20-some years, 21 years, somewhere around that. And he's acquiring wealth through this. But then Jacob, in verse 29, we see Jacob comes to Laban with a business proposition. And I want to read this to you, and then we'll kind of give a synopsis. I know my time is getting short. So, in verse 29, so Jacob said to him, "You know how I have served you, and how your herds have fared with me. For you have very little. You had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me. And now, when will I also do something for my own family?" Laban asked, "What should I give you?" Jacob said, "You don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock. Let me go through all your sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted, every dark-colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats. Such will be my wages. In the future, when you come to check on my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are not black, they will be considered stolen." "Good," said Laban, "let it be as you have said." That day Laban removed the speckled and spotted male goats, and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one that had any white on it, and every dark-colored one among the lambs, and he placed his sons in charge of them. And he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. Jacob, meanwhile, was shepherding the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob took then branches of fresh poplar, almond, and plane wood, peeled the bark, exposing white stripes on the branches, and he set the peeled branches in the troughs in front of the sheep, in the water canals where the sheep came to drink, and the sheep bred when they came to drink, and the flocks bred in front of the branches and bore streaked, speckled, and spotted young. Jacob separated the lambs, made the flocks face the streaked sheep and the completely dark sheep in Laban's flock, and then he set his own stock apart and didn't put them with Laban's sheep. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the troughs in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flock, he did not put out the branches, so it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban, and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich. He had many flocks, female and male slaves, and camels and donkeys. And so we see here the accumulation of Jacob's wealth came in some dishonesty. However, Jacob managed to work out this deal with Laban, and so Jacob, over a period of time, he accumulates the stronger sheep and leaves the weaker with Laban. And so this brings us then to jealousy and malice, because the sons of Laban are like, "Hey, wait a minute, this guy has come in, he's married our 2 sisters, and he's taken great wealth from our father. Before long, everything's going to belong to Jacob." And so Jacob heard this. Jacob decides that we're going to leave. And so he talks to in chapter 31 of Genesis, talks to his wives and says, "We've got to get out of here. Your father's face is turned against me." Then Jacob says in verse 7, "He's cheated me. He's changed my wages 10 times. And so they all decide, and they're like, "Well, we have nothing left. We're married to you. The sons get everything. Whatever you think God wants you to do, we're going to follow you." Might have been the wisest thing that they had done from the time that they had married him. But we see here that they go on, and we see that they leave, and they're really running from Laban. Laban finds out, and Laban catches up to the family on the run, and he encounters Jacob, and he says, "Why did you sneak away? These are my children, my grandchildren. I would have blessed you and sent you away, And then Laban says, now you've not only taken my daughters and my grandchildren, but you've also stolen my idols. Here's the thing that we see within this family as they're on the run, is that there's the pagan practices of Laban are being carried from their homeland and are going to be carried down to eventually into the promised land in Canaan, where Jacob is going to go back to. And so we read in Genesis 31, Jacob's like, nobody stole anything of yours. If you find your stolen image idol, then that person will be killed. And so Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the idol. And so Rachel hears what's going on, puts the idol under her pillow. She sits down on the pillow, and as her father searches through the tents, he comes to Rachel's, and Scripture tells us that Rachel's like, pardon me if I don't get up and greet you on my menstrual cycle. And so Laban doesn't find the image, and the family moves on from there. However, we find that the moving on brought a lasting resolve. And I want to read that to you as I close tonight. As Jacob and Laban come together, they make this covenant together. And chapter 31, and we see, hold on just a second, I lost my place and turned too much. Verse 44, come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, let it be a witness between the two of us. So Jacob picked out a stone and set it up as a marker. And then Jacob said to his relatives, gather stones, and they took stones and made a mound, then ate there by the mound. And Laban named the mound Jegar-Sahedutha, but Jacob named it Galeed. Then Laban said, this mound is a witness between you and me today. Therefore, the place was called Galeed, and also Mizpah, for he said, may the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of each other's sight. And we see here that Mizpah actually means a watchtower. And so at the end of the day, the lasting resolve was to allow God to bring them to a place where they could be unified as much as possible. And when we allow the purpose of God and the plan of God to lead us, guide us, and direct us, let us go back to this point, and let's remember Mizpah, the watchtower. Let's allow God and His purpose and His plan to be the watchtower over us, the refuge over us, so that we don't make some of these sinful mistakes based on selfishness, jealousy, malice, and envy. And so think about the life of Jacob, and next week we'll get into chapter 32 as Jacob prepares to meet Esau and reunite with him. Until we meet again, may God bless you. Good night.